Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the second day of Louisiana Wind Week. Today, we will be focusing on the conversation on how to minimize and also, first and foremost, how to understand the potential impacts to the environment, ecosystems, and species with the development of offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico. We have a fantastic group of panelists today here, with us. We'll start off with three presentations, kind of providing an overview of the natural resources in and around the Gulf, and then look at some of the impacts or some of the ways to mitigate impacts. And so we'll start off with a presentation from Erica Rule, Chief of Staff for Science Planning and Operations with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. We'll then pause for some Q&A. Then we'll have a presentation from Randy Wilson, Supervisory Wildlife Biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then we'll pause again for Q&A. Then we'll have a presentation from Rebecca Green, Senior Scientist with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, to overview some of the ways to mitigate and measure impacts to species with respect to offshore wind development. We will also then pause for Q&A before opening it up to the roundtable discussion. We'll then have introductory remarks from Patrick Banks, Assistant Secretary for Fisheries with Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, Randy Myers, Assistant Secretary for Wildlife at Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, Catherine Bowes, Program Director with the National Wildlife Federation, Brent Newman, Deputy Director with Audubon, Louisiana, and we have a new addition, Zachary Chain, who's also with Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Before we head into, and then at the end of the program, we will have ample time for Q&A and comment from our audience. Really, we want to keep this conversational. One of the main points of Wind Week is to engage stakeholders and the public to help educate ourselves and each other about what potential impacts could result from offshore wind development and how to avoid and mitigate, because this is really a critical component of determining the appropriateness of where to site and how to operate offshore wind developments. And so very excited to have this conversation early and really before there is any lease sale or any developments kind of deeply in the planning phase, because the earlier we can identify issues, the sooner we can and easier it is to avoid them or mitigate them. And so before we hop into the presentations, for those, just a little housekeeping. During the Q&A, you can certainly type in your question into the chat feature or into the Q&A feature. Either one, we'll be checking both. If you'd like to speak your question or comment, you can raise your hand, pressing the raise hand button located under the reactions on the lower part of your screen, and then I'll unmute you at the appropriate time. And those are the last, the only real housekeeping components. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Erica Rule to share her thoughts and provide an overview of the role that NOAA plays in offshore wind development, and also overviewing some of the aquatic species in the Gulf of Mexico. So Erica, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to share my screen, bring up the presentation. And Randy, if you could just confirm that you're seeing the slide in presentation mode.
This looks great.
Great, thanks. So good morning, everyone. As Randy said, my name is Erica Rule, and I'm happy to be here with you today from NOAA Fisheries. At the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, our job is to provide the scientific advice and data needed to effectively manage the living marine resources in the Southeast region, and that includes the Gulf of Mexico. And so we're excited to be here to talk about the offshore wind development opportunity and transition to new, more renewable energies within the Gulf of Mexico region in general. And so looking at the administration's wind energy goals and advancements in technology, the scale and pace of offshore wind development will only increase, potentially covering large areas along our coast, as you're seeing here a map of the more modern footprint of oil and gas within the Gulf. And in the Southeast, we have a long history of offshore energy production and a good track record of collaborating with different agencies, states, and industry, and a sound body of science to help inform decision-making for things like siting. And so this is an unparalleled opportunity from our perspective to get science in at the ground level at what could be the beginning of a major change to the system. And it's an opportunity to take a holistic look and a cumulative approach. So the way that we've been approaching what this development of wind in the Gulf of Mexico means for us is we kind of put it into 4 science buckets. And the first one is our role that the NOAA regional offices play in terms of their regulatory mandate to manage our trust resources. And in our region, that's led by the Southeast Regional Office, or SERO. In the second bucket, it's more looking at the Southeast Fisheries Science Center and the role that we play in providing data and analysis that directly supports that regulatory process. In terms of offshore wind development, we monitor and study where the animals are within the potential development spaces and where our fisheries might overlap. The third bucket for us are potential impacts on our science surveys and the science advice that they inform. So we don't yet know how these structures would impact our surveys and our ability to manage those trust resources, so that's a priority for us. And then lastly, we just need to understand what the impacts will be to our actual trust resources and the fisheries within the Gulf of Mexico region. And so looking at our surveys, NOAA Fisheries collects and maintains one of the world's richest sources of marine life data on the planet. The data that we collect and our analytical tools and our expertise can inform wind siting decisions and evaluate impacts to trust marine resources. In the Gulf, we've been operating these regional surveys. You see a number of them listed on the screen. On the right-hand side. And we've been doing those since the 1980s. And together with the Atlantic surveys, it actually represents over 242 years of overall effort in monitoring both benthic, pelagic, and protected species. On the left, we've made some visuals to help understand where we conduct those surveys, so the footprints that they cover, and mapped over the 3 different areas that are currently designated for potential planning areas for offshore wind. And so you can see that there's going to be some overlap. And so we have a lot of data to help understand where these might be impacted and how we need to look at mitigating impacts to surveys that we conduct regularly. So NOAA Fisheries has decades of data on fisheries operations. We have expertise to analyze, interpret, and share this data to inform siting decisions and evaluate impacts on fisheries and fishing communities. So these data help us understand where, when, and how fishing occurs along our coast and the importance of those fisheries to our coastal communities. And so, for example, in the Gulf, that represents more than 15% of the total US fishing in terms of value, and shrimp is about half of that, with about $420 million in value in 2018, and menhaden coming in top volume in 2018. And so in recreational fishing, in terms of that, our region supports one of the most valuable fishing in the US, with more trips reported than the rest of the nation combined. And our angling community is engaged, they're active stakeholders, and they compose a major part of our regional fishery. And so if we take a closer look at that valuable commercial shrimp industry I mentioned in the Gulf, what we're seeing is that the bulk of the fishing effort is concentrated in the Western Gulf off of Texas and Louisiana, as noted by the warmer red colors showing where we see the greatest amount of fishing effort and where that industry operates could be impacted. And so you can see areas off of Brownsville, Texas, and Western Louisiana is an area that we probably want to pay close attention to in terms of how they might be impacted. Offshore wind development could substantially affect recreational fishing economies and coastal communities. Rec fishing in the Gulf contributes over 13.5 billion in trips and durable goods. And so recreational fishers will want to be able to access these offshore wind farms as opportunities for continued fishing in the region. You see some images there where we've already seen rec industry taking advantage of these new structures. Offshore wind energy development covers large areas along our coasts and has significant interactions with highly endangered species. And NOAA has the data, tools, and partnerships and expertise in conducting science in support of managing those species. NOAA Fisheries has a special regulatory role in managing marine mammals, as well as protected species mandates, such as the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act. And so several of these species are endemic to the Gulf, such as Rice's whale, and many are endangered or threatened. So wind energy, we know it's going to alter their habitats and potentially also the health and behavior of the animals. So timely, accurate, and precise data is essential to inform siting and management of these wind development areas. And we can get data like this into models to help tell us where species like dolphins might be and where the mitigations will need to take place. So looking a little closer, one of the things that we're able to do is to help inform where areas that are of concern for these species could overlap with wind development. So here's a slide that shows how we can use data on species distribution and habitat preferences, and in status, everything ranging from endangered to threatened, to derive probability maps of overlap between where protected species are and the marine industry. So here we show a probability map of Mexico, Gulf of Mexico Brutus whales, 5 different sea turtle species, small-tooth sawfish, and the giant manta rays. And this image was an analysis was recently conducted for the aquaculture opportunity in the Gulf. It's a comprehensive set of spatial planning tools led by our partners at NOAA and NCOS to identify suitable areas for aquaculture. And this could be adapted for offshore wind scoping as well. NOAA Fisheries can create similar maps for other areas, which can assist in NEPA and EIS statement preps. So we can adapt mapping like this to offshore wind development areas in federal or state waters, because as we know, our trust resources don't necessarily know when they've crossed the line from federal to state waters. So other aspects of our trust resources are our fish and invertebrates. Here we're looking at the summer groundfish survey biomasses similar to the map that you saw previously. Many fish and invertebrates, including shrimp, red snapper, groupers, and many other species provide the foundation of a lucrative fisheries and a productive ecosystem. So our flagship surveys provide long-term indicators of areas of highest overlap of these species with potential offshore wind energy development. So the map is showing the groundfish trawl survey that shows the highest biomass in the coastal regions. And we can do this sort of a map for any of the species that we monitor. Probably one of the most important things for us is to make sure that we consider the entire ecosystem of the Gulf as a trust resource. So we know that offshore wind energy development is going to grow, and it's going to result in changes to the marine ecosystem, which can be challenging to predict at this point. So this image from the Gulf of Mexico Ecosystem Status Report documents the interconnectedness of the entire system of one of the most heavily industrialized and highly productive large marine ecosystems on Earth. And as you can see, we've got human activities in there, from fishing and farming and water use, recreation, management, and energy extraction. And they play a critical role in the inseparable roles between all of the systems as drivers. And so like the offshore oil and gas industry plays a substantial role in the ecosystem, we envision the full realization of this administration's goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. Will also have a substantial role in this ecosystem. And so we need to do the science to understand how this new driver will play a role in this total ecosystem. And so one of the key messages for us from the oil and gas infrastructure is that it's essential to understand the cumulative impacts of individual projects, and to take a holistic view of the Gulf. And so at this vantage point, we have an outstanding opportunity to do what we weren't able to do because oil and gas was getting started before we had this sort of capacity. And so we know more about the Gulf ecosystem now than we ever have. And it's really a great time to sort of apply the science we have at the onset of offshore wind. One of the things we want to know is understanding how offshore wind will interact with our NOAA trust resources. So initial research indicates that there are a number of outstanding questions in terms of what are the effects of hydrodynamics from the actual wind turbines? What would the sound do for impacts over different life cycles, mainly during construction, but it's something we need to document throughout the life cycle of the wind farm structures. We know that there could be increased or modified vessel activity depending on the regulations for navigation around these structures. We're looking to the northeast that's conducting some studies on what the electromagnetic fields are and how that might impact our resources. And then as the images on the right show, we know that these structures really serve as artificial reefs in the substructure, and they end up being an area where we see a lot of our trust resources gather and fishing, and people use them as fishing areas. And so definitely things that we need to look at going forward. And lastly, we want to highlight that this also brings together some opportunities. In the Gulf of Mexico and other areas, we have been able to use different sorts of technologies to really bring about new ways to understand and observe. And so we've been deploying things like technology on reefs and oil platforms that can use artificial intelligence and video, like you see in the right, to identify species. We can use remote operated vehicles and use them to collect things like environmental sampling of DNA to detect rare species. We've got passive acoustic monitoring for Rice's whale, and all of these can be used or deployed on wind platforms potentially. And so we welcome partnerships with BOEM and support their mission of really trying to figure out how to make this first-in-class science going forward. We've got a long history of working with a lot of partners, as we mentioned before, with BOEM, federal and state partners, and we're really excited to be able to leverage this to help bring offshore wind into the Gulf of Mexico. We know how to do permitting. We've got the science and data to inform science decision-making needed to maintain a robust industry, a productive fisheries, and a healthy ecosystem. We've been doing this for 70 years, and we look forward to conducting the science to support offshore wind development. And with that, I'll just say thank you very much, and a quick nod to the staff and partners who helped us pull this presentation together. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. That was a fantastic overview. A lot to chew on in terms of the role that NOAA is currently playing, and then in terms of looking at potential impacts to species. And it sounds like there's some additional research that needs to be go into sort of the electronic or the magnetic field component and the sound component. I've kind of open it up to questions. There's one general question about allowing access to the presentation documents. Governor's office is happy to post the slides, if or a PDF of the slides, if the panelists are willing to share. But otherwise, we will be posting the video of this session on the governor's website as well. There is a question from Brent McRosen. Where are the gaps and opportunities for passive acoustic monitoring, in your opinion? What's the greatest unmet need in this area? Are there any?
Oh, that's a great question. And actually, if it's one that I could track down and get back to you on, because I would really love to check in with the folks who are leading that particular effort. I know we're doing it, but in terms of identifying what gaps are, I'd really, if I could make sure I get that person's name, we can find a way to get back to them.
Certainly, and we'll capture all the questions and we'll provide a follow-up. I guess in the meantime, do you mind sharing? I'm not entirely sure what passive acoustic monitoring is versus other acoustic monitoring.
So basically we're listening. So we're listening to what's going on, who's out there, and able to use things like artificial intelligence or post-analysis back in the Science Center to be able to understand as we have arrays of these, so we can track not just when a species is moving through an area, but as we have arrays set up in some of the areas to help define critical habitat, we're able to use that data to see how they move through an area, what their residence time is, use that combined with other observing data to understand what they're doing throughout their life cycle. So that's some of the work that we're doing with passive acoustics.
Okay, excellent. There is another question. This is from David Becker. Given all the data you already have, can you identify statistically where the best places as far as NOAA is concerned for offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico?
So Yes, although that analysis has not yet been done. I think we have a lot of information to inform that sort of analysis, and that's kind of what we were trying to show in the presentation. Based on all of the surveys and the observing that we do, it's just a matter of taking that into perspective along with the intended sighting locations as we go through the process with BOEM.
Excellent. He was looking for a map, but it sounds like it's still kind of a work. There are other maps, like the ones you included, that were kind of created for different purposes, like for the aquaculture kind of review.
Exactly. If we went through the same process we did for the aquaculture siting, I think that we would come up with some similar products where we would be able to identify, at least from a trust resource and fisheries standpoint, where the least impact could be. And then it's a matter of course, as you'll hear from other presenters, the process of looking at other use within the region, and then everything like that first graphic that shows where the highest potential for wind is in the Gulf of Mexico, which of course BOEM needs to consider for lease locations.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine some of the information that BOEM is receiving through their request for information and interest will be shared, amongst the federal family, and that also may help inform, by providing outside information or data sets. So this is kind of really an information gathering period. And then Ruth Perry asks if the aquaculture products are available to the public.
They are. I will pull up the link to that and I will share it in the chat window for that one. We do have that available.
Okay, excellent. And that will kind of provide, she's looking not only the maps, but also looking to understand kind of the scientific process for how that study was conducted. Excellent questions.
Anything else, Randy, or is that it?
I think that is, I do love the, the bringing in of resources that were, created for, or studies that were created for other purposes, and kind of pulling them in to help inform and kind of leveraging existing work or, previously done work. So that's fantastic.
Exactly.
Sounds like that's, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, so aquaculture specifically for the Gulf of Mexico, but of course, the Northeast is where wind is really leaps ahead of us. And so we are actively coordinating with our NOAA partners in the Northeast to understand what have they identified, what have they already done, what can we wholesale adapt into the Gulf of Mexico region, and then what do we need to just sort of make sure we're putting on the radar, and then conducting analyses as needed for species-specific, habitat-specific, physics of the Gulf, and looking at that as a whole ecosystem.
I think we'll move into the next presentation. Otto Candies, I see your question about mitigating impacts to marine life and impacts to commercial fishing industry. I believe we'll get into that question a bit with Rebecca Green's presentation, and then so we can follow up kind of a little later, and we'll certainly pose it more directly if we need to follow up. And then there's also tomorrow's panel, which is looking more directly at existing users, and certainly we have a couple of representatives from the commercial fishing industry, so that we'll really get into the impacts on the industry side tomorrow. And so next we have Randy Wilson, supervisory wildlife biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey. Randy, you'll be presenting on birds and migratory pathways. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay. So Harry, can you just confirm, are we in presentation mode?
Now you are, yes.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Thanks, Harry, for the invite to be on the panel this morning. And so, similar to what Erica relayed for NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, has regulatory responsibility for overseeing the implementation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, as well as the Endangered Species Act, for species that kind of are terrestrial, except for maybe manatees in Florida. So, as opposed to me going down that path, there's been a lot of interest around birds in the Gulf of Mexico. And so I've opted to focus my talk this morning on kind of bird biology, ecology, migration pathways, kind of bring everybody up to speed on kind of what do we know and don't know about migratory pathways through the Gulf of Mexico. And so why is the Gulf so important? And so you think of it this way, essentially all roads lead to the Gulf. Across Canada, the United States, the Gulf supports about 2/3 of the breeding bird population across those two countries. And more recently, we've kind of learned that we're also supporting a large number of species coming off like the coast of Africa that's used in the Gulf kind of as a transient period post-breeding in those cases. And then not to kind of lose sight of the fact that there are a large number of breeding birds in the Gulf, as well as a large number of species that use the Gulf for an overwintering wintering habitat. So it's kind of a full annual life cycle aspect that we need to keep in mind here. So species that we're talking about, I made reference to about 2/3 of the North American birds, right at about 400 species of birds, representing about 53 different families. And so when we get into these conversations about what are the impacts to birds, don't be surprised if somebody asks you, well, it depends, right? What bird are you talking about? We're talking about ducks, northern gannets, prothonotary warblers, right? So they all utilize the Gulf and have different migratory pathways. So we need to be really explicit when we start talking about impacts to some of these bird species. So kind of keeping the focus high level here, so the numbers of birds utilized in the Gulf, a recent study produced by Horton et al. Estimated between 1.8 and 2.3 billion birds migrate through the Gulf during the springtime. It's important to note here that they use, weather radar to determine this number. And so this was only looking at nocturnal migrants with a northward trajectory. And so it does not account for any birds that were doing diurnal migration, nor does it account for any breeding birds. So the total number of birds utilized in the Gulf, say during the spring period, it's somewhere well north of 2 billion birds. It could be up to towards 3 billion birds. So it's a high volume of individual birds in the Gulf. So migrations, everybody's like, so when is migration? Spring migration is typically defined as kind of March through May, and then a fall migratory period, kind of an August through October time period. There are exceptions to the rule, right? It depends. There's always an exception, always a footnote. Things like a lot of the waterfowl, they may initiate their spring migration a little bit earlier, say in February, start leaving the Gulf, but then they may not arrive until November, well outside of the bounds of when you might think of normal migration. Other things like a purple martin, it's a bird that overwinters in Central and South America. They start showing up in February. So again, it depends, but in general time frames, March through May and then August through October is the time periods that we're kind of worried about. So thinking about migration, nocturnal versus diurnal, I made reference to that earlier. There are, both activities or mechanisms happen across the Gulf. Some of the diurnal migrants are largely, pelicans, hawks, falcons, some of your larger bodied birds, but then also some swifts and swallows. Of note, swifts and swallows can forage on the wing. They're aerial insectivores, so they can migrate during the day. Whereas the nocturnal migrants are normally your smaller passerine birds, warblers, flycatchers, etc. The migration at night takes advantage of the weather conditions, less turbulent air, protection from those raptors that are migrating during the day. And also a lot of these birds utilize the stars and the moon for navigational aid as they're migrating across. So how do they move through the Gulf system? Well, again, it depends, right? So there's a couple of different ways. In general, there's what we call trans-Gulf migration and circum-Gulf flights. So trans-Gulf will be going from point A to point B straight across. Circum-Gulf will be kind of hugging the coastline, coming around. You can see that kind of depicted in the graphic here. And I'll show a few examples in kind of real life of that. And so the means of assessing that is we're kind of limited to individual observations, which is kind of difficult in an ocean environment. Tagging studies, and now the radar ornithology using the weather surveillance system is showing to be kind of our go-to means right now. So looking at some individual data, this is from our the GOMAPS project that Erica mentioned, Gulf of Mexico Marine Assessment Project for Protected Species, funded through BOEM. If you look at something like a resident species, a royal tern, you can see them largely congregated kind of in that near shore environment, with a few dots out in the more pelagic environment. Whereas if you look at kind of a band rump storm petrel, a more of a true pelagic species that's coming off the coast of Africa, they're in the deep waters, the pelagic waters, largely off of the OCS, right, off of the shelf. Looking at some satellite tag birds, here a swallowtail kite. Since we're talking about kind of Louisiana here, the picture on the left, a couple of birds were radio tagged in South Louisiana during fall migration. One opted to go pretty much straight across, while the other one opted to kind of hug the shoreline and go all the way around, take the long way around through Mexico. And then during spring, coming back out of the Central and South America, Yucatan Peninsula is critical. A lot of birds utilize here as a jumping off point to come straight across, or some birds that are breeding in Florida will kind of, ease off to the east. But again, here's kind of the trans-Gulf versus that circum-Gulf migration pathways. Just picking at, another species, a large-bodied shorebird, the whimbrel, makes this big, long, kind of crazy fall migration flight out into the Atlantic to their wintering grounds. Again, coming back during the spring, Yucatan is a stop, and then jumping across the Gulf. So again, there's really no rhyme or reason. Kind of, they're just coming to the Yucatan, and based off of weather conditions, they're probably picking a flat path and jumping it back towards the mainland of the U.S. Similar story again with some smaller passerine type birds. Prothonotary warbler, for those birds that are breeding in the Mississippi River Valley, they kind of come straight south to South Louisiana, jump straight towards the Yucatan. Whereas birds on the Atlantic seaboard are kind of following down, funneling through South Florida, and then jumping across or going straight to Cuba. Purple martin is an interesting one. They're kind of, seems to be kind of depends on where they breed in the US. So birds that were radio tagged in Texas seem to kind of follow this circum-Gulf pathway, where this one individual from Manitoba followed the Mississippi River down, made a straight shot across. Bird in Florida, kind of, again, similar pathway, South Florida down to the Yucatan. So again, both flight paths are in order. There's kind of no rhyme or reason. It's like, I got to get across this big body of water, and however the winds and the weather patterns may assist me is the way I'm going. All right, where am I at? Okay. So radar ornithology, this has actually been around for several years, probably 20, 25 years, that my colleagues who utilize this technology have really fine-tuned it. It's pretty amazing work. The graphic on the right shows, the flock of birds dispersing out of the dry tortugas. So we can use this information to get both spatial and temporal kind of information. From a spatial, so again, so this is spring migration, kind of similar, following the pathway that I referenced earlier, kind of an April through 1st of June. The different colored lines represent the different weather stations around the Gulf. So again, looking at them station by station, you can see coastal Texas, the bend area there, has a large volume of individual birds utilizing that area. Then we can actually look a little bit finer scale to see, all right, where are those birds within that radar pattern or zone. And so we can really start identifying and fine tuning kind of where birds are utilized in the Gulf Coast region. So this information would be, should be informative as we get to thinking about pathways and the sighting of turbines. Like if we know birds are generally going in this direction, then maybe we can site towers off cycle from those pathways, if that made any sense. So to summarize that, about 400 species of birds, somewhere well north of 2 billion individuals utilizing the Gulf. Migration pathways are variable, both a trans-Gulf and a circum-Gulf kind of varies by season and by individuals. So there's some temporal relevance, that spring and fall migration. Also, we need to be considering the resident birds who will also make foraging forays offshore, 20, 30, 40 miles to forage. Transient birds moving in to spend kind of our summer months. It's almost like a wintering for them. And then the spatial relevance, things that we kind of have seen pop up over the last few years through the various data sets. The Texas coast and the mouth of the Mississippi River seem to be kind of important areas, as well as the barrier island chains. And then somewhere around the shelf break, about the 200 meter mark, that seems to be where the pelagic birds are more kind of hanging out, probably due to upwellings and so forth associated with the break itself. And so I wanted to kind of conclude with one slide to kind of talk about some potential consequences, some data gaps, uncertainties that we have related to birds utilizing the Gulf in terms of wind energy, wind farms. So there's direct and indirect effects. From a direct, there's individual effects through direct mortality, kind of the obvious. But then there's also potential impacts to the population. I think Erica mentioned it earlier. So there's potential for cumulative impacts. So you have one turbine, it might kill one bird, two birds. But as you magnify the number of turbines, right, so that all goes up. So then we need to be thinking about R versus K selected, short-lived, long-lived species, their reproductive kind of life history traits, to think about how those cumulative impacts might actually influence a population of birds. Some indirect effects that kind of is an unknown area. Again, this is something we're kind of learning some from the Northeast, but displacement or avoidance. More research seems to be coming out daily about birds that are avoiding wind farm areas, just in total. Like, I'm out of here, I'm gonna go move my feeding grounds over here somewhere. That results in loss of habitat, which could also be an attraction, and Erica touched on this one. So as you have a new structure in the Gulf, well, it increases or attracts forage fish. Well, there's a lot of, gulls, terns, et cetera, are foraging on these small fish. Well, we could be potentially attracting birds to the turbine or the wind farm. And then all of that kind of culminates in increased energetic cost, right? So if I have to fly around or over and maneuver around a wind farm, that's an increased energy demand. And on a small passerine that's just migrated from Colombia, I may not have those energy reserves to make it to shore. And then that loss of habitat just due to displacement, thinking about things like wintering species. There's some like scaup or foraging offshore, northern gannets, et cetera. If all of a sudden that footprint becomes unsuitable habitat, now they have to shift, and there's potential energetic demands and costs associated with that. So there's a lot of uncertainties kind of balled up. I didn't get into the specifics of those. That's kind of where the higher level uncertainties are. And so I'll just conclude here with kind of that consultation technical assistance. This is the BOEM planning process. As I made reference last week on the BOEM call, the Fish and Wildlife Service stands ready to engage and provide consultation technical assistance, whatever resources we have available to facilitate this whole planning exercise. And with that, thank you for your attention, and I'll take any questions we have at this time. So Harry, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Randy. That was fantastic. A lot to chew on, just with the different species, with different migratory patterns, residents, just different flight patterns and behaviors. A lot to chew on. We do have a question from Charles Nelson. How many migratory species fly above 200 meters?
Okay, that's an awesome question. I'm not sure that there's any literature that would give us a definitive number. The general rule of thumb is during migration, birds are probably at 1,000 to 5,000 feet, kind of above the ground or above, sea level. That's during migration, and then that's all dependent upon weather patterns. You get, weather events, heavy storms, fog, you're going to push birds down. Clear bluebird days and nights are probably a little taller, a little higher. But then we can't forget about birds that are foraging, just foraging during the day. They're anywhere from the seafloor or the seafloor, from the top of from the water up to 100 to 200 meters. So they're kind of spread out all across the altitudinal gradient there.
Gotcha. So once again, it depends.
It depends.
Well, while we're waiting for any other questions to come in, I know it's early in terms of looking at offshore wind development in the Gulf of Mexico, but are there any species in particular that give you the greatest concern at this stage? Whether they're threatened or endangered, or perhaps keystone species that kind of are critical for the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So the one that's probably on at least my radar would be like black-capped petrel. It's a bird that breeds in the Caribbean, but up until a couple of years ago was thought to be rare in the Gulf of Mexico. but through the GOMAP surveys, we've documented a significant number, way more individuals than we thought should be there or would be there. It's a species that's been petitioned for listing, and we know little about in general. So with an apparent increased abundance of black-capped petrels, it's a pelagic bird. It's going to be just soaring around, foraging offshore. That one probably has a lot of potential impacts or consequences to it.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thanks for taking a stab at that one.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question from Margie McNair-Prey. Is anyone directly involved looking at bladeless technologies?
That's out of my expertise. I might punt that one to
Yeah.
Rebecca. She may know better on that technology question.
I think there's that is something that I think was addressed yesterday, and that for folks with information on the opportunities to deploy or study bladeless technologies, that BOEM would be accepting. I mean, as part of their request for interest and request for information, that is the kind of information that they're looking for, it sounds like. Let's see. We have a question from David Becker, disclaiming that he is not an ornithologist, but given that birds fly thousands of miles, going around a wind farm would seem little distraction to them. So is the question not mostly how to make sure birds avoid wind farms? Nature adjusts pretty robustly environmentally, so it seems kill is a major concern. So I don't know if that.
No, it does. And so if we're thinking about from a migratory perspective, yes, you're correct. Birds are flying thousands of miles. But think about birds that left Yucatan and Mexico flying straight across the Gulf. I mean, they've been airborne for 8, 10, 12, 14 hours. They're exhausted. And so detouring around a wind farm is probably not energetically feasible for them. Like when they hit shore, they literally fall out. We call it the fallout, because they literally basically just fall out on the beach and just sit on the beach or the barrier island until they kind of regain their composure. We're talking about migration the other way from, a fall migration. They're a little better suited, right? They're energetically more fit. They may be able to handle that detour during a fall migratory event. There's still some of those unknowns. That spring migration is the biggest concern, with birds being in the air for 10 hours plus already.
Gotcha. One of our panelists, Patrick Banks with Wildlife Fisheries, asked, what impact have the wind farms in North Dakota had on migrating waterfowl? Perhaps this could give some insight on the issue.
Yeah, as far as I know, there hasn't been a significant impact on the migrating waterfowl. I haven't really kept up with that literature. That's in North Dakota, South Dakota. But I haven't heard any of my colleagues, jumping up and down and crying wolf over the turbines in the prairies. Mm-hmm. But I have to get back to you with that one, more details.
Just thinking about onshore wind farms, is that really where I think there read concerns about kind of quantifying bird mortality of offshore wind, where they don't drop on the ground, they drop into the water. And so is onshore deployment of kind of the detection technology really where that accuracy is honed, and then it's kind of moved over to offshore?
Yeah, I would say definitely for sure. That's where it's honed, right? That's where we started. But even onshore, I just read a recent paper where they used dogs to come back behind, an observer who was walking a transect, and the dogs found twice as many birds or dead birds as the human did, right? And so it was estimated, I don't know, I forget, say the human found 1.5, the bird or the dog found 3.5. right? So there's actually a doubling effect. And so the numbers is about 500,000 birds annually from onshore turbines is the bird mortality number. And that was from like human observers. If you add in correction factor, so now you're around 1 million birds. That still doesn't account for, scavenging by other critters. So it's northward of 1 million onshore. The assessments offshore are going to be problematic, right? Because any mortality events, birds fall into the drink. They float away. They become, forage for tuna or sharks or whatever else decides to eat the floating bird. So assessing mortality events offshore is going to be problematic.
Yes, yes, indeed. There's a couple questions, and maybe this gets into Rebecca's presentation, but looking at black blades, painting blades black, are there any particular mitigating efforts or technologies like that you're aware of that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is looking into specifically?
The painting the blade black, that was a recent publication that came out that showed decreased mortality events related to turbines that had one blade painted black. I'll leave that one to Rebecca to maybe to clean up. There's some other technologies, some deterrents that you can put on the blades or the carousel. I think that's still experimental to see where the placement should be located. There's a variety of things that people are looking into. The technology seems to change daily. So I'll let Rebecca handle all those kind of technology questions.
Okay, and there was a question about the species of kestrel that you referenced earlier as one of some concern. Is it the black topped?
Black cap petrel.
Black cat kestrel.
Yeah, black cap petrel. It's a pelagic seabird that breeds in the Caribbean and then kind of quote unquote spends its winter, which is our summer, in the Gulf environment.
There's a question about whether we're using data sets from North Sea wind farm or observations from other areas where offshore wind has been developed for quite some time.
I would say we're currently not using the data set because there's nothing to use them for. But we are in contact with our colleagues and other partners in the Northeast to see what data sets they have, what their lessons learned are, as well as we've been under the previous kind of push for wind energy about 10 years ago. We made some close contacts with our European partners to see kind of what was going on, what they were learning from offshore wind in the European market. So we have some insight and connections and partnerships and data sets available. It's just a matter of figuring out what the question is we need to be addressing and answering, and then we'll pull the appropriate information together.
Thanks, Randy. See a couple other questions, but more kind of on the mitigation side. So I think it'd be a good time to move into our next presentation from Rebecca Green, who is a senior scientist with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL. Thank you for joining us, Rebecca. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Harry. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Fantastic. Let me get my presentation into view mode here. Let's see, slideshow from the beginning. Great. Well, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you today and to see such great participation in this event. Thank you to Harry for organizing us. My name is Rebecca Green. I'm a senior scientist with NREL, which is the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. I'm actually speaking with you from New Orleans, where I've lived for the last 20 years. So here is a Gulf Coast resident. So right here in our own backyard. And it's really my pleasure to talk with you today about minimizing potential environmental effects from offshore wind energy development, including lessons learned from around the world, especially Europe, other coasts, and considerations for the Gulf of Mexico. In terms of my own background, my PhD is in biological oceanography. I've worked in the ocean sciences for about 25 years now. And for half of that time, specifically in ocean energy, offshore energy management, the last several years focused on offshore wind, various offshore wind activities. Previous to joining NREL, I worked at BOEM in the Gulf of Mexico Regional Office for 9 years, and it's really great to see the outcomes of baseline programs such as GoMaps. So for those of you who aren't as aware of NREL's environmental sciences background, I just wanted to provide a brief overview of that. For approximately the last 30 years, largely in the onshore space, and now having moved into the offshore space, NREL's environmental sciences team has worked to serve as an unbiased organization with a leadership role in convening stakeholders to identify and address research priorities in terms of the potential environmental effects of wind energy development. We are a research institution conducting data-driven studies to both monitor, mitigate impacts of wind energy development on wildlife. We have experience, as I mentioned, in the onshore, the offshore, the US, and internationally, including through IEA wind activities. Some of the collaboratives that we have worked to form over the years have included the National Wind Coordinating Collaborative, the Bats and Wind Energy Cooperative, and under IEA, the International Energy Association, and a very active group called WREN, or Working Together to Resolve Environmental Effects of Wind Energy. There are 3 pillars within NREL's environmental science program right now. The first is better understanding environmental processes and performing impact assessments using various types of advanced technologies on wind turbines or for siting purposes before the turbines are built. We also perform species-specific scientific investigations, looking at the physiological and behavioral mechanisms associated with wind turbines and wildlife interactions. And finally, we do a lot of work on working with industry members and other partners to develop cost-effective mitigation solutions. So collaborative research approaches for mitigation solutions that really enable wind energy facilities to operate as efficiently and sustainably as possible. I thought it might be useful also to bring some national perspective to our conversation today. So there are currently 29 states around the country that have the potential to generate energy from offshore wind. So good to maintain our perspective within that larger scope. There are a host of considerations that go into siting of offshore wind development. Certainly, first and foremost, are actual technology considerations, including water depth and wind speeds. So where is it even feasible, or does it make the most sense to build these types of offshore wind farms? Then, of course, the wildlife and habitat aspect, which we're focusing on together today. Fishing activity is a key consideration. I don't have slides on that, but if there are questions, can talk about that more. Visual impacts, how far from shore is it necessary in terms of viewshed considerations to develop considerations around existing fishing lanes, DoD and military operations, and cultural resources. So this is a host of siting considerations from the larger perspective. I wanted to start out with the Gulf of Mexico example, and certainly we've heard a lot about this from both Erica and Randy in terms of the offshore living marine resources that are so important in the Gulf of Mexico. You've seen this wind resource map now a couple of times. This is the average wind speed at a hub height of 100 meters.
Rebecca, I think your screen is frozen. Perhaps it's just me,
1,000
but
meters. Sorry, Harry, were you going to say
sorry,
something?
your computer froze for about 10, 15 seconds.
Oh, okay. Am I back now?
You're loud and clear coming in.
Okay,
Perfect
maybe
now.
I'll stop my video while I'm talking just to increase my bandwidth. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, so on this wind speed map, where you're seeing the colored wind speeds are where the wind speed is greater than 7 meters per second and within depths of 1,000 meters. This wind speed map will continue to evolve as we improve our modeling methods and collect better measurements of wind speed. Certainly, there are wildlife migratory ranges and habitats within the Gulf, including examples here for sea turtles and the northern gannet. But we heard a lot about this as well in our earlier talks. So I thought it would be interesting to bring in an Atlantic example of considerations for mitigation and monitoring. And this is specifically from the Vineyard Wind 1 final environmental impact statement, which you may have seen. But there's a really informative table in this EIS that has considerations for monitoring and mitigations. And I've pulled out just a few here as examples that might be relevant for future work in the Gulf. So in this case, they have a piping plover protection plan. So depending on the species of interest, this type of thing could be developed. The use of bird deterrent devices, certainly pre-construction monitoring, which is required, and everything that goes into that. The use of avian and bat post-construction monitoring programs, annual bird mortality reporting, benthic monitoring, passive acoustic monitoring, a pile driving noise report, exclusion zones for marine mammals, and in this case for the North Atlantic right whale, passive acoustic monitoring. So these are just a handful of examples out of a much longer list of the types of things which we might see implemented in the Gulf of Mexico. I did want to tell you about a couple of national level programs that myself and my colleagues are involved in through the as funded by the DOE. One is our SEER project. This is the US Offshore Wind Synthesis of Environmental Effects Research Project, which we're performing jointly with PNNL, another national lab. It's a multi-year DOE funded effort to facilitate knowledge transfer on offshore wind research from around the world. So I did hear that question earlier, and certainly we're bringing those lessons learned internationally forward as much as possible. And a lot of the industry members who are involved in offshore wind development have that experience, for example, in European waters as well. We're synthesizing that environmental effects research and looking right now at applicability to US East and West Coast waters, but certainly there'll be some relevance in our products to the Gulf as well. Our primary products are educational research briefs. We'll be hosting a webinar series and having coastal workshops, again, on the US East and West Coast. If you're interested in these products that we're developing, please do get in touch with me and I'd be happy to disseminate them. We identified 8 priority topics that stakeholders wanted to know more about, including underwater noise, collision risk, in the case of floating systems, the impacts of cables on marine life, benthic disturbance, the introduction of new structures and fish ecology, behavioral effects on birds and bats, the impacts of vessels, so support vessels and collision risks from that, EMF or electromagnetic field effects. And these are all topics where our steering committee felt that, and we felt that there was enough information where you could put together a really significant educational research brief on existing research. This is also an example of our team's development of a strike detection sensor in offshore. So we talked a little bit about, challenges around mortality monitoring in offshore waters. So this is some research that our team's been performing to install strike detection technologies and test them at NREL's Flatirons campus in Boulder, working together with Oregon State University and WEST, and then validating these sensors and camera systems before deploying them offshore. So there are interesting and novel methods for mounting these types of systems to better understand strike detection and mortality risk in offshore waters. And these technologies are currently being developed. Also, I wanted to mention, this is actually my last slide, a monitoring and mitigations database that our team is developing for DOE on the TEFIS platform. So essentially, we're establishing and maintaining a database of technologies for monitoring and mitigating environmental effects of wind energy. This has information for both offshore and land-based technologies, how these technologies can be integrated into wind turbines or other aspects of the physical structures at a wind farm. The team is assessing technology readiness levels in terms of how close to deployment we actually are, and then making all of this information available on the TEFIS website. So there are examples here, such as for noise abatement and the use of bubble curtains during offshore foundation installation, the use of camera systems, and mounting these onto things like blades and nacelles. So that's the end of my formal presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have relative to what I said or other. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was a great overview. And we do have some questions that are really focused on, it looks more like blade design and kind of adjustment of the height of the blades. And I would wonder if that is something that would be in the mitigation technology database that NREL's put together. Or is that on adding add-on features?
Yeah, aspects of blade design itself wouldn't be part of the environmental monitoring database that I'm talking about. But if you have questions on that, we can separately discuss offline or after the meeting. Feel free to get in touch with me. My email address is rebecca.green@nrel.gov.
Excellent. Jamie Simmons asked whether you could share the resource with the research briefs. So we can either drop it in the link kind of later, or if you want to share it with me, we can post it as part of the materials. And I'll be collecting presentations and post that on the governor's website for those interested in circling back a little bit later.
Yeah, and our research briefs our first ones will be made public starting in, I want to say, probably August. So we're just finishing the first couple up, they're under review, and then those will be made available.
Okay, well then they should probably go to the NREL website for those. There's a question from Joseph Jaberja. Hi, Rebecca. Could you explain that graphic pertaining to the percentage of 2019 electricity usage that can be generated by offshore wind in multiple states? So I think it was, if you know the one that he's referencing.
Yeah, and actually that was from not from our own NREL research in this case. I was primarily using that as an example of how many states in the US either have specific targets for offshore wind and renewable activity, or are pursuing interest currently through feasibility studies, such as the feasibility study that the Gulf of Mexico did. So in terms of coming up with actual percentages, there are different ways of going about that. But really what I was using that to show is that there are a large number of states that are looking at this offshore wind opportunity and who have very specific targets in place.
Thank you for explaining. David Becker asks, I'm surprised EMF is a concern. EMF does not propagate or penetrate into salt water unless it is very low frequency, 0.01 and less. And I would expect wind generation is not that low of a frequency. And I don't know if you can speak on that or.
I can, yeah. So that list of 8 topics that I presented, which probably resonated with some of you, were topics where actually quite a bit of information already exists. So in terms of EMF, electromagnetic field effects, there have been studies performed on both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and quite a bit of information already for various species. So that is simply a question that comes up with stakeholders quite often, where the agencies and other folks on our steering committee felt like it would be useful to get the existing research out there. So not implying it's a concern, but implying that people ask the question a lot.
Gotcha. Thank you for clarifying. Craig Jones asks, Rebecca, you mentioned the importance of acoustic effects and the previous PAM work. Boehm or Bessie recently embarked on significant PAM work in the Gulf of Mexico. Is this work being actively folded into evaluating good baselines for future projects in the Gulf?
Yeah, hello, Craig. I'm not actually part of that new passive acoustic monitoring program, so I would probably let Erica answer that question. I will say that from a community perspective, it's really important that we make as much information as possible that's being collected out there available through appropriate websites and marine planning tools, whether it's the Marine Cadastre or other NOAA websites, so that we can all access those data sets and perform our own analyses. But if someone else wants to speak more to the current passive acoustic monitoring program, I'd welcome that.
Yeah,
Erica, if you have any comments?
Yeah, no, it's similar to my previous comment. I'm aware that we do it, but as far as I'm probably not the best person to provide that level of detail right now, but I will put my email address in the chat. So if anyone wanted to specifically send me that follow-up in an email, and we'll get that information back.
Thanks, Erica. And if Boehm is doing some work on that, then they would, as the lead agency, would be certainly folding it into their evaluation, in the lease process. There's a question from Zach Eubanks. Is the team basically, I think that with respect to kind of testing the efficacy of the detection, the bird strike detection technology, that they're using a potato gun to simulate bird strikes at the Colorado site? Or maybe, I don't know if you can maybe elaborate on some of how you're testing the technology of simulating bird strikes.
Yeah, and again, I can provide more information on that as well. So it is simulated, obviously, from what you were looking at there, and the types of sort of puck-like material that was being used. Yeah, so it is an artificial target that's being utilized and essentially being launched at the turbines, the test turbines that we have on site at the NREL Flatirons campus, to test out the strike detectors that are on the blades of those turbines. So yes, it is in fact an artificial material that's meant to simulate a bird.
Gotcha. We have another question, kind of similar to a previous one, about looking at other jurisdictions, wondering if Mexico has any offshore wind, or perhaps any other of the nations in the in the Gulf of Mexico that you'd be whether they. I'm not familiar with any offshore wind developments, but maybe there are, and maybe somebody could speak on whether they've heard anything about other nations in the Gulf region looking at offshore wind. Maybe that's one we can follow up on and kind of look into. Certainly, we want to pull in as much information and as many partners that are interested in looking at offshore wind, and kind of to not duplicate efforts and only strengthen our understanding. Okay, I think if I missed somebody's question, please repost it. There have been a lot of great questions, so I apologize if I missed any. This is from David Becker, asking about the slide with respect to electricity generation on regional offshore wind siting map. Why is Texas not more than 200%? Is this map a function of just generation meeting demand, or a combination of both?
Yeah, again, the actual numbers on that map I would take with a grain of salt. There is a reference on that slide. I wasn't really referring to the exact numbers, but rather the potential for offshore wind to contribute to the energy needs in any particular state.
Gotcha, thanks for clarifying. All right, well, thank you for your presentation, Rebecca. We'll now move into our roundtable discussion and welcome our other panelists. And I'd like to take the opportunity just for our additional panelists to kind of offer their initial thoughts and any reactions or comments to some of the questions that may have been asked for the presentations. So first, we'll start with Catherine Bowes, Program Director with the National Wildlife Federation.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you all. That was a really informative set of presentations. Really looking forward to diving into the discussion. As I'm Catherine Bowes, I direct our offshore wind energy program here at National Wildlife Federation. For those who aren't familiar, National Wildlife Federation is a national conservation organization based in DC, but with offices around the country. I am based in our Northeast office, which is where we have led our offshore wind effort for the last 10 years. Of course, my colleague David Muth and others from our Gulf program, you all probably work with often as well. It's wonderful to be on this panel, and I really applaud the governor's office for pulling together Wind Week and specifically having a section on this. It's really important to engage on this stuff early in the process, and that would be sort of among my highlights of lessons learned. National Wildlife Federation has been a strong supporter of offshore wind energy development done right. We definitely believe that offshore wind has a critical role to play in confronting climate change, and that it is an essential new clean energy source that can be developed in a responsible manner that protects wildlife and maximizes economic opportunities and helps advance environmental justice in these challenging times. But getting it done right is essential. And so it's great to have this panel on minimizing environmental impacts. And I'll just share some initial thoughts from what we've seen on the East Coast and the ways that that are really important for advancing strategies to minimize impacts. Again, first off, state leadership, convening conversations like this early. So you've got stakeholders and experts helping identify the key questions that we're going to have in this region, identifying the data gaps and technology needs that we're going to have, and then getting those plans in place to fill them, because there's a lot. Rebecca was just talking about some great work and incredible research that can be done. So identifying those questions early for the species and stakeholder concerns that need to be addressed, and driving that research so that we are able to ensure strong scientific integrity and stakeholder input can guide the decision making. down the road. But I'm sure we'll be talking a lot. We have been talking a lot about leasing and permitting, and we will on this panel. But I want to also just note that opportunities for minimizing environmental impacts also come to us in the form of the state market policies that are driving this industry. I know you have a panel on that topic later in the week, but there is a relevance in the discussion today here, as we've seen on the East Coast, a really positive increasing trend of state leadership in bringing responsible development criteria into that market policy, so that, again, early in the process, planning for responsible development and minimizing of impacts can come in. So and also research funding requirements that can come from those state policies. So really great opportunity in state and federal policy, both on the market side and leasing and permitting, to ensure that every step of the way, from the siting, the identification of leased areas, on to the review and approval of the projects proposed in those areas and the survey plans, each step along the way offers opportunities and needs to ensure that we're assessing impacts and advancing strong protection strategies to minimize them. And different species are impacted in different ways throughout the development process. So it's complex, but exciting and important to get right if we're going to really, set this new industry off on a solid footing here in the U.S. So lots to talk about in the details, but maybe I'll just leave it there and underscore that, again, really getting in place early plans for the research and the stakeholder input that you're going to need along the way is key.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome to the panel. Next, I want to introduce Brent Newman, Deputy Director of Audubon, Louisiana.
Thanks, Harry. So everyone, I'm Brent Newman. I'm the Policy Director for the newly christened Audubon Delta, which is the regional office of the National Audubon Society, covering Arkansas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Just again, I'd like to echo Catherine, actually, and just saying that if we're going to start having a conversation about offshore wind in the Gulf and off of the coast of Louisiana, convening a group like this with all this information, Harry and the governor's office, again, thanks for doing this. This is exactly how it should begin. So folks will say, we've heard the National Audubon Society, so how are you plugged into this sort of conversation? A lot of people are familiar with the work we've done as far as community science. We do a lot of refuge and center maintenance and stewardship around the country, and especially along the Louisiana coast. We do a lot of coastal stewardship, informing people about beach nesting birds and how we can protect birds in the places they need. But about 10 years ago, the National Audubon Society took a hard look at what we were doing and said that, if we're really serious about protecting birds at places they need to thrive, we need to start talking about what we can do for climate adaptation and mitigation. Our climate science report came out in fall of 2019, Survival by Degrees, that showed that 389 species of North American birds would be at elevated risk of extinction if we allow the average temperatures to reach the 3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So there's the problem. What are we doing about it? The National Audubon Society created their Clean Energy Initiative. So we have a series of staffers who work on responsible siting of clean energy sources, and we have policy staff across the country who work on policies and at the local, state, and federal level that will incentivize clean energy sources in a responsible way. As Catherine said, doing it, but doing it right. As far as why this is important to the National Audubon Society, I can't say anything better than Randy did. The diversity of this region, the importance of the Mississippi River alluvial valley to so many different species of birds is right there in front of you. So what do we do about it? Audubon supports clean energy, the environmentally responsible offshore wind included in that is sited and properly operated to avoid, minimize, mitigate, and monitor for the impacts on birds, wildlife, and the places they need now and into the future. We work closely with partners like everyone on this panel, be they federal agencies, state agencies, different non-governmental organizations who are working on the issue, to support, expedite, and expand the development of clean energy policies, planning, and projects to achieve 100% clean energy. So that's the plan. We work on this in several different regions, looking at the Atlantic, Pacific, Great Lakes, and across the Gulf of Mexico as this conversation gets kicked off by partners like this and with the new task force getting kicked off. Why this is important for us additionally, our coastline is host to a suite of Audubon important bird areas. They provide key habitats for a variety of shorebirds and colonial nesting seabirds, roosting, foraging habitat for wintering sea ducks, shorebirds, and white pelicans. When you're talking about the impacts of offshore wind development, you're not just talking about the turbines out there in the Gulf, you're talking about potential onshore infrastructure that could affect these areas, such as new ports, cables, and substations for these projects. we have a lot of seabirds in the area. And I think that Randy did a great job of talking about the different kind of migration patterns that are happening and how, again, how crucial this area is. So what can we do to help develop this way to do offshore energy and to do it right? I think if you've learned anything from this panel, it's the importance of monitoring and the importance of funding different studies that can tell us what we don't know. The most important thing that we know is how much we don't know and how we can get there and how we can, programs like GoMaps, some of the different initiatives of NOAA, of NREL that are looking at these sort of mitigation strategies and looking at what we can learn about the Gulf of Mexico and the different ecosystems and how they interact. These sort of things, these high resolution surveys, radar, telemetry, and collision detection is going to be crucial as we put together a monitoring program to inform an adaptive management framework to adjust our operations if needed to maintain populations of these protected birds. So we're going to continue to advocate for the state of Louisiana, for Congress, and for our federal agencies to support regional research funding and publicly available data in collaboration with BOEM, NOAA, and other federal family agencies. In operating these offshore wind platforms, additionally, we can draw on the lessons learned. We have a robust and long history of oil and gas platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, and they've learned a lot of lessons along the way that I think will be beneficial in how we can operate offshore wind in a beneficial way. You can port in a lot of lessons learned from European wind energy, from what's happening in the Northeast, what's happening with onshore wind, such as mentioned in the Q&A earlier in South Dakota. And I think a lot of these lessons learned will be applicable to what we do in the Gulf of Mexico, but we should also be prepared to pivot and to adapt to what we learn along the way. One more thing I'll just throw in as kind of a last recommendation. You're already doing this with these panel this week, but engaging as many stakeholders across a diverse spectrum as you can to get as many points of view at the table as early as possible, to do some spatial data planning and identify areas of the Gulf that have a least conflict sort of characteristics, that where offshore wind can be sited with the least opposition, the least impact, and the most efficient permitting to meet the state's and the nation's clean energy goals. So again, thank you so much for convening this group of experts, and I'm pretty excited about this conversation.
Thank you, Brent. Great comments. Thanks for joining this panel. Sorry, Catherine, were you? Okay. Well, next I want to welcome, we are very well represented by our Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and appreciate your participation on this panel. And just want to offer opportunity for, we'll kind of run down the line. Randy Myers, if you have any opening thoughts, reactions with respect to what we've heard already, or offshore wind development generally.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to even be on this panel, and very interesting discussion. I really thought the presentations were very well put together and covered a lot of the things that I even had questions about, particularly from the migratory bird perspective. And as let me introduce myself first. I'm Randy Myers, Assistant Secretary, Office of Wildlife and Fisheries, and obviously my department, our office is responsible for the impacts that this might generate to our wildlife resources, and particularly migratory birds, but also impacts to marine mammals and sea turtles as well. And I'm sure Patrick Banks will get into the discussion about fisheries in a second. And I like the other two, Catherine and Brent, talked about the engagement of stakeholders at an early stage. I think this is very critical, so that we can have these engaged talks and try to think through these. And I think Randy has made a very good point. It all depends. Impacts to wildlife, it all depends. Location, you're talking on land, near shore, offshore, and the impacts of those species are going to change depending on those locations and timing of the year, et cetera. But I also think it's important, and I think it's been mentioned, that we identify these data gaps, and then we figure out how we fit the research to fill those gaps, so that we can make informed decisions as we move forward.
Thank you, Randy. Welcome to this discussion. Next, Patrick Banks, Assistant Secretary for Fisheries with Wildlife Fisheries.
Thank you, Harry. I appreciate, just like Randy said, being on the panel. I don't know that I have anything more to add. This has been quite comprehensive this morning, especially with respect to fisheries. I think Erica did a great job of explaining all of the various pieces of data that we have out there. And we're a very big and a long-standing partner to NOAA to collect a lot of those data sets that she mentioned off of the state of Louisiana. And so I think the information is there to help us make good decisions. I like the discussion about engaging stakeholders, because certainly if we think about the stakeholders in the Gulf, the shrimp community is a big one, and they cover a lot of ground out there. But another one is menhaden fisheries, and I'm just not talking about the boats, but the spotter planes that are up at these elevations where these turbines are. And so we have to think about not just the boats, but the ancillary activities going on around the boats. So very good discussion, very good presentations, very helpful to me to help me learn more and more about this issue. And I appreciate being a part of it.
Thank you, Patrick. And that's a great setup and plug for tomorrow's session, which is really engaging the stakeholders, or the first step really in engaging stakeholders. And we have AC Cooper from Shrimp Association and Shane Treadaway from West Bank LLC, which is a big menhaden fishing company. So that conversation will continue tomorrow, and really just the beginning of that conversation. And then we have Zachary Chain, also with Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries.
I didn't have anything to add at this time. Just listening in. Thank you.
Okay, I appreciate it. I will stick with our wildlife and fisheries folks, just kind of working our way from the coast out. I think there's, looking at the maps that I've seen, there's just more congestion, more activity, more on the coast, particularly I think with migratory birds, resident birds, transient birds, and Wildlife and Fisheries manages multiple WMAs, wildlife management areas, refuges, and conservations on the coast. And so in evaluating the appropriateness of whether to let a wind lease on state lands or waters, from the state side, the Department of Natural Resources is charged with evaluating and letting those leases. They have the jurisdiction, but they're required to consult with Wildlife and Fisheries with respect to any lease that would overlap a WMA or refuge. And so kind of based on what you've heard today, what are some of the things that, in evaluating the appropriateness of, siting kind of in or near a WMA or other protected area, kind of anything that you'd care to highlight in terms of how you would, go about that process of evaluation, what you would want to know or consider?
Yeah, I think one of the important things is to look at our like you mentioned, our WMAs and refuges across the coast, and ideally I feel that that's probably where most would start looking is if you were going to do inshore because of the wind that's available, and but we would look at specifically at each one individually depending on where the area may be selected, or someone looking at possibly doing this, and look at the overall overarching reason why those refuges were established, right? A Rockefeller Refuge, a lot of our refuges are primary wintering grounds for waterfowl, but they also serve stopover opportunities for near tropical migrants. And we'd look at obviously the impacts that might have to those resources and the timing of that, and particularly in the southwest part of the state, we had a reintroduction of the whooping crane, and utilization of those areas such as White Lake and Rockefeller wildlife refuges, and let's see how that would be possibly negatively impacted, and just try to get a cumulative look at those impacts. But we'd also not just talk about migratory birds. I mean, we'd be concerned about overall impacts to wildlife, whether that's terrestrial, looking at the marine mammal life or sea turtle life, and like I mentioned earlier, and then look at the best science that we have, and make recommendations based on that for avoidance. I know there was a discussion about using black blades, and but also the types of lighting. I know there's some research out there that these birds and animals may using the best science that we can, so that there would be an avoidance of that impact.
Thanks, Randy. And as a follow-up, does the department kind of monitor or quantify, the different species that are, stopping over or residing in the WMAs, or, and kind of, is that a data input that can be shared with BOEM as they're evaluating, and kind of with DNR as they're evaluating, interest in?
We have, yeah, sorry, Harry, I apologize. We do have a long-term data set looking at, different species. It's not comprehensive. We have data sets that show the rookeries, nesting areas for birds, which would be an important consideration as well. We have waterfowl surveys that, we've had 40, 50 plus years of data, transects across the coast and looking at wintering waterfowl and the timing of those birds whenever they arrive in Louisiana. There's a lot of Christmas count data, information about those species that we capture. So yeah, we do have a lot of data sets, a lot of information. Our natural heritage section has a lot of the information on rare, threatened, and state species of concern, and that ties into our wildlife action plan on how we will move forward in managing those species. But yes, we do have that available.
Thanks, Randy. I kind of want to ask a similar question for you, Patrick. Looking at our coastal waters, just what are some of the considerations that you would want to provide to DNR, as that if you're looking at not only wind leasing in coastal waters, but also there's the transmission component of connecting, if you have development in federal waters, to connect onshore existing substations and infrastructure. So what are some of the things you would want to consider, or any concerns with, with particular species, whether threatened, endangered, or kind of keystone species?
Well, that's a big question, but one of the main things that we would look at when evaluating a project like this is you're right, not just the siting of the actual turbine, but the where are the transmission lines going? And just like we do routinely with the oil and gas community, we encourage the use of existing pipeline corridors, things of that nature, so that we can try to minimize the impact of the transmission of the product, whether it's oil, natural gas, or in this case, electricity. So we would probably want to try to guide the applicant to use some of those existing corridors that are out there, because it helps us minimize impacts to very important habitats such as oyster reefs that we have an extensive amount of in state waters in Louisiana. So, and then also to minimize the impact to the emergent marsh habitat, which is extremely critical for all of our estuarine dependent species, such as brown and white shrimp and redfish, speckled trout, things like that. So I think helping to guide the companies to those existing corridors is going to be critical to try to maintain or to try to lessen impacts on some of those key habitats that we have in coastal Louisiana.
Thanks, Patrick. Moving over to Brent, you had mentioned in your opening remarks engaging stakeholders in this conversation, and just you mind just elaborating on kind of what's specifically kind of which stakeholders do you have in mind, and kind of what are some great ways to engage early and often?
Sure, and thanks for the question, Harry. I think that I can't underemphasize how important it is to build a big table. I think that if you look at the all-star cast of characters you guys have assembled over this week of sessions, I think you're making a pretty darn good start at it. It's not just environmental stakeholders, it's not just regulatory folks, but it's also people who may bring perspectives to the table you didn't expect, who can make the regulatory process and the permitting process and build a better project. And a lot of the work that we've done in Orleans Parish ought to have been aligned with a series of environmental justice, climate justice advocates. We worked with a lot of people who advocate for affordable energy, and we learned so much about our own clean energy policies and what we can do at the municipal and local level to not only advocate for birds, but advocate for people. And I think when you're talking about the impacts to wildlife, you're also talking about opportunities for economic development along the Louisiana coast. You're talking about the beneficial impact to the Louisiana economy. There are a lot of people who are going to come at this from different perspectives, and the more people you have at the table from the get-go, the better I think of a final product you'll have. And just building on that a little bit, I think you can't underestimate the amount of help that all the data that people have talked about today is going to provide to building that better picture. Having a common technical platform of all the different resources people talked about today for all stakeholders to engage on, to be able to access, and to be able to understand the impacts equally across the room is going to be huge. It needs to be well funded. It needs to be regional. I think that Erica pointed out a couple of times that our migratory birds do not pay attention to the boundaries of our states or where we say our development zones are going to be. So making sure that our data repositories and the studies that we're doing cover the entire region. And that was a pretty important question earlier about, what sort of development's happening from the Republic of Mexico, what's happening in Cuba, what's happening in this entire region that makes up the Gulf ecosystem. So there are a lot of people to bring to the table, but everyone's going to have a perspective that'll make a better mousetrap.
Thanks, Brent. And that's certainly what Wind Week is poised to do, is start the conversation. We look forward to working with all partners and stakeholders to convene more forums, or specialized forums, depending on kind of meet people where they are, and share, provide their input, and certainly if we can to the extent we can amplify BOEM's request for information and interest process and other processes, to provide more formal input. That's kind of what we're here to do. And Catherine, I see you want to jump in.
Yeah, I'd love to build on that. I think, as Brent was saying, and sessions like this that are open to stakeholders to get a lot of input are key. I also think it's important to look at states along the East Coast have set up, sort of formal bodies, and they vary by state, the scope and how they function and who convenes them based on the different needs of the state. But it really does create a more robust engagement of some key stakeholders and technical voices over time. So you can kind of, we're all in this together here for many years. There's a lot of steps to this complex process. And so building some formality into that to ensure that you're really getting good input over time is key.
Thanks, Catherine. I fully agree. And I want to stick with you. So Randy Wilson, in his presentation, touched on cumulative impacts to birds in that context. Under NEPA, BOEM is going to need to consider cumulative impacts for offshore wind developments. And I just wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of how to best go about evaluating cumulative impacts of a development type that has not yet begun in the Gulf of Mexico. So kind of starting from scratch, we're thinking through the cumulative impacts. Do you have any thoughts or care to sort of offer some insights that maybe you've seen on the East Coast of or in Great Lakes of or the West Coast, for example?
Sure. It's a really key question. As you said, it's central to the NEPA process here and the importance of ensuring that solid environmental reviews happen and the resulting documents are also solid. And the cumulative impacts question is a real big one. And we're glad to see BOEM do a robust cumulative impacts analysis for the early projects. And as you said, it's tricky, right? We only have so much data here. We have 7 offshore wind turbines in federal or in U.S. waters, state and federal on the East Coast. So we have a bit to learn from that. We have a lot to learn from the European offshore wind industry. We have, the U.S. oil and gas industry, the U.S. onshore industry. So there's a piecing together of data. But at this point, we need to do the best we can with what we have, transfer what we can, and identify those questions that remain and put in place research to answer them to kind of help improve our cumulative impacts assessment over time. So this gets easier. We're in a tricky spot right now with given where we are in our development of the industry. So I think it's key to think about it through the perspective of all the impacts that species are experiencing. So looking cross sector. So not just what are the potential impacts of the building of this offshore wind facility, but how is that going to impact the species that is also experiencing impacts from other industries perhaps at the same time. And then another key piece is also ensuring that we're looking at and the East Coast, we're looking at the building of multiple projects perhaps at the same time. So thinking about not just the development of this project in isolation, but looking at the permitting pipeline and understanding how many applications have come before the agencies for pre-development survey work, for example. How much of that HRG survey work is going to be going on at the same time that there would be pile driving there. So really looking holistically at the environment that these species will be in as a result of the approved decisions. So it's definitely a tricky one, and key to common theme here, key to it is identifying the questions we have, fund the research, and make sure that the decision making really is keeping pace with the best and current science.
Definitely. Brent, do you want to jump in as well?
I would just emphasize everything Catherine just said. I think that it's so exciting to see so many different data platforms coming online and seeing the different states and different federal agencies studying the different impacts here and looking at different ways to map it. But I think when you're looking at cumulative impacts, you have to take sort of a conservative approach. Just because we don't have data on it yet doesn't mean there's not risk involved. So it's an iterative process where we learn more and more and more. And then there's that all important phrase, adaptive management. As we actually start operating these projects, as we start constructing them, we have to be prepared to pivot a little bit and to adapt operations based on what we learn along the way.
Excellent. I want to turn now to Rebecca. Oil and gas activities have been ongoing off of Louisiana's coast for some time now. And I was wondering if you could, and we kind of touched on it a little bit, but do you mind putting kind of in sharper relief kind of the similarities with oil and gas development that offshore wind presents, and maybe some of the lessons learned, in terms of avoiding or mitigating impacts, and then, at the same time, kind of explaining the differences and what's new to the equation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as Erica said at the beginning, we see the Gulf of Mexico as a fairly industrialized basin, a large marine ecosystem, but also a large marine ecosystem that's very productive. And we have had a long history of energy development in the Gulf of Mexico, and many lessons learned around offshore structures, interactions with the environment and society and the fishing communities, as well as how monitoring using offshore structure can leverage the use of offshore structures. So I would say that monitoring programs and baselines that have been developed around offshore oil and gas activities can certainly be leveraged to also inform baselines around offshore wind development that may be occurring in some of those same areas. There could also be some really great opportunities for working together with industry to collect new industry and technology developers to collect new measurements at and around offshore structures. Because we do need to think about the entire balance of system, from the wind turbine itself to the type of foundation that would go out there, to the scour protection, cabling, and substation. And there are some really good opportunities for working together to collect monitoring data both above and below the water.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Erica, I have a question already posed to the wildlife folks, but kind of in terms of fisheries, what are some of the species or ecosystems that you're most concerned about kind of at this stage? And recognize it's kind of early in the process, but any particular species or ecosystems?
Yeah, so we mentioned it we covered it in the presentation earlier, but the two biggest commercial industries that we see likely to be impacted is the shrimping industry. Again, $420 million in 2018. And then as was referenced earlier by Louisiana State, the Menhaden fishery, which is top in volume. And so those are the two, just because of their size and the numbers we have on them, we know we need to pay attention to what the impacts are going to be there. And then the other thing I just want to reiterate is sort of what everyone's been saying, is we really need to take an ecosystem-wide view for this. I know at the moment there's just potential of 3 sites within the Gulf of Mexico that were in the very early stages, but that's why we keep pointing to the expansion of oil and gas, because everybody starts somewhere, but given the tremendous change in technology and the rapid development. I was listening to the other gentleman from NREL who presented at the task force, and he was even saying even the information that was in their most recent study is already out of date because of how things are progressing. And so we really want to make sure that we're not just doing evaluations at a one-off by one-off, because you really need to look at what the potential for this is based on future growth, and make sure that we're taking informed decisions at that perspective, and keep that big picture of the entire ecosystem in balance. And so I think those would be the biggest things, from NOAA's perspective.
Thanks, Erica. That's great. I know we have kind of the last 15 minutes, so I'm going to ask my last question, and it's for everybody on the panel. But we've talked a lot about research needs, filling information gaps, and there's a lot of ongoing work. But I guess I want to ask, what is a research need or an information gap that needs to be filled and isn't currently in the pipeline of projects, of research projects, something that you think needs to be elevated and somebody needs to start working on?
I can go first.
Anybody can jump in.
I can go first. So, marine cadastre is one of the great partnership products that we have between BOEM and NOAA to be able to look at, mapping with all of the synthesis data that we have within the region. But one of the additional tools, one of the assets that NOAA brings to the table is socioeconomic specialists, people who can really look at, the human dimension side and the economics of our user groups in the fisheries. And so one of our scientists originally came from the Northeast Science Center, and there they've developed this really cool, bioeconomic planning tools. And that is something we really haven't been able to develop yet in the Southeast that I think would be really important. And these are things that take into account things like stock biology, along with data from the fishery captains and fleet behaviors, federal management decisions, fishery economics, port structure, and then now wind farm development in addition to that, and really projecting, in addition to changes anticipated from climate change, for example, over the next 30 years, and how things will expect to grow and change from that economic standpoint as well. And so I think that that's an area that we would like to be able to bring capacity and growth for informed decision making beyond what we already have.
Thanks, Erica. Anyone else care to hop in? Catherine?
Sure. I would add one thing that we've been pushing hard for on the East Coast is advancement in a real-time monitoring system for whales. Two of the major impacts to whales from offshore wind development are the underwater noise from the pile driving. You want to make sure they're not in real close at an area where they could be harmed. And the ability to monitor that in real time is essential, and not as advanced as it could be to really support the industry. And the same is true for real-time monitoring to help minimize the risk of vessel collisions. Ship strikes are a major source of impacts to whales. And so being able to ensure that the increased vessel traffic is able to slow down, that technology seems like something that would have a huge impact in our ability to minimize these impacts. But it's something that is definitely in need of advancement and research and attention.
Thanks, Catherine.
So Harry, this is Randy Wilson. So I'll add one in there in that. So as we've seen, there's considerable data available already, but just using like the GOMAPS data, for example, that was collected at the scale of the Gulf of Mexico, from the US-Mexico border around to the Dry Tortugas. So like, I know our sampling framework was, we're only putting one data point every X number of square miles, because that's giving you a representation of the Gulf, which that allows us to generate maps like Erica showed. But once we have proposed sighting locations, a key data need would be to fine tune our surveys within those cell areas, such that, as with BOEM showed, there's like kind of, it's a nested approach, right? Here's the lease, and then it gets smaller and smaller, because there's going to be areas within those lease cells that are probably more vulnerable or better suited for siting of tower or turbines. So, the need to be ready to implement those sort of surveys once we know proposed lease blocks would be really informative to reducing some of the potential negative impacts to our natural resources.
Thanks, Randy. Excellent point. And yeah, there's the sort of chicken and the egg, or wanting to wait until you know where the development is going to be, but then also wanting to have the lead time to have some body of data set, kind of more developed. So great point, though.
Harry, I can jump in as well. I
Please.
know there was that perspective that I believe Erica referred to, or might have been another speaker on, essentially alluding to the fact that turbines are always getting larger in the offshore. For the most part, in some ways, bigger can be better in terms of capturing energy in the offshore. And so we're probably looking at even larger turbines now that might make sense in the Gulf of Mexico. So looking towards the future in terms of what those swept areas, hub heights, and blade lengths might look like is an important consideration. And also, it's not too early to think across the entire life cycle of the wind farm, all the way from construction through operations and even decommissioning, depending on the types of materials that are used at and around a wind farm. There may be some eco-friendly considerations for material types, and it's great to think all the way out to that decommissioning phase, even early on.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Great points. And please, if anybody in the audience has any questions, please type them in or raise your hand and I'll unmute you. While we wait, your comments about kind of the lifespan and life cycle of turbines and infrastructure, I guess, is it already being looked at, this sort of how impacts might change over a 30-year span with respect to the changes in that climate change is going to bring potentially to activity and behavior of different species, or change in where the habitat is. Is that already being looked at as sort of it's not necessarily going to be the same today as it is in 30 years, or it very likely will not be. And so how to account for that in the review process.
Yeah, and other folks on the call might have a better answer to this. It certainly is an important perspective to bring so that we're planning for the next 10, 20 years, even in terms of wind resource, to the extent that that's possible. But certainly I know in East Coast waters, we've seen some shifts in habitat and species distributions, and to the extent that we can bring that planning in the Gulf of Mexico as well, I think that would be great. I don't know if others have thoughts on that.
While y'all think on that, we do have a couple questions. Idrissa Boubé asks, Brent, can you give us some examples of the environmental justice organizations that Audubon is working with? I imagine probably same goes for NWF. With Catherine.
Yeah, sure. Just some of the work we did in Orleans Parish. We worked with 350 New Orleans, the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, the Alliance for Affordable Energy, Sierra Club. It was a whole coalition of folks who were working to find a way to equitably reduce people's bills and transition New Orleans to a more clean burning portfolio.
National Wildlife Federation has a robust environmental justice program that we're really proud of, and has been growing certainly in recent years. And a lot as far as offshore wind specifically, it's definitely been, it has varied at the state and federal level, the engagement of groups along the way in the state and federal processes. One of the things that we've been really excited to see most recently is, as I mentioned earlier, some of the state market policies advancing in ways that prioritize responsible development, including opportunities for minority economic participation in the supply chain, and other ways to ensure that there's some transition here into this incredible new industry.
Thank you. David Muth asks or comments that it is well known that while most trans-Gulf migrants fly high above the platforms, they are known to drop to the deck and are attracted to platforms under certain circumstances. Exhausted diurnal migrants during the day in inclement weather and nocturnal migrant birds attracted to lighted platforms at night during inclement weather. Further, non-trans-Gulf nocturnal migrants routinely overshoot the coastline and land on offshore platforms before returning to shore. This is an area that will need further research. Shiloh Felton asked Rebecca, can you tell us what gigawatts and or max heights we might expect by the time turbines go in the water in the Gulf of Mexico?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shiloh. I wish I could. I think that as development, as we get further along in the planning process, we'll learn from the size of turbines that are being built in East Coast waters, which even continues to change, as you see in the news, like at one of Ørsted's sites recently. So by the time, if we do get to development in the Gulf, we'll most likely be, industry will most likely be deploying the state of the art. And, you know, there are reference turbines up in the 12, 15 megawatt range now. They haven't been deployed yet, but good to think ahead to that future.
Thanks, Rebecca. Mark Scheck-Snyder asks, has anyone explored co-locating aquaculture with these wind turbine clusters?
I'll just mention from a fisheries perspective, yeah, I'm not aware. Obviously, that's something that NOAA is, you know, involved in on both fronts. So I think that we would definitely be looking to coordinate planning within those areas.
Yeah, this is Patrick. I was going to say basically the same thing. I don't know that any specific look at that has occurred, but NOAA's mapping that they're able to do as part of their aquaculture opportunity areas and things could certainly be overlaid with this. But as I appreciated it, a lot of these wind farms try to keep any kind of fishing activity away from the structures, from what I understand. So I don't know whether that's going to be a possibility, but it's certainly worth a look. It's something that Mark has looked at many times over the years, whether when he was with Sea Grant or when he was with us. We've all hoped to be able to use decommissioned oil and gas platforms in an aquaculture opportunity, but it just hasn't happened. So it's a good question. I'm glad he brought it up. I think it's something we need to keep in mind. That's a possibility.
Thanks, Patrick. Well, we are coming to the top of the hour. I do want to take our last comment. The one person who's raised his hand, Frank Kidd, I'm going to unmute you right now. And so I believe you can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, yeah, I asked this question in the Q&A. What's the survivability? What's the hurricane survivability of these windmills, offshore windmills?
So in terms of the structures themselves, so I know that's something that the NREL study had looked at that they did last year, and you know, I don't know if Rebecca, if you were able to elaborate on kind of the state of the technology, but I know there are some blades that have typhoon, you know, class status in terms of, you know, they've been rated to withstand certain, I'm not sure what wind speeds, but I think that is something that the industry is rapidly developing. I think there's some deployed in kind of Southeast Asia, off the coast of Southeast Asia, but I don't know if you care to elaborate or are able to, or otherwise we can turn it over to the Friday panel looking at market participants. We'll have LM Wind as one of the companies that develop and study blades for turbines. And so, Frank, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to just come back on Friday for more information. But thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you.
And so with that, we are just about the top of our hour. I just want to thank all our panelists today for this discussion and providing your insights. I learned a lot. I hope those in the audience and our fellow panelists learned something as well. Tomorrow, we will turn the conversation to a related topic, but really bringing in existing users of the Gulf of Mexico to really kind of think through those impacts and how to avoid impacts to existing users. Then Thursday, we'll look at connecting offshore wind farms to the grid. And so talk about transmission planning and power purchasing. And then Friday, we will wrap up with a look at our supply chain capacity, past, present, and future. And so with that, just as a last housekeeping item, we will be posting these videos on the governor's website, and we'll be collecting the presentation slides, and we'll be posting that as well. So once again, thank you all very much, and thanks for attending Louisiana Wind Week. Y'all take care.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.